So how it got its legs was honestly, I would go out and sell. I still try to do that. And I think from there, it kind of expanded out into, we need a team and so on to do that. That's part one of it, but I also think it's the way the industry does things. So when you look at any suppliers into these restaurants, they've got reps. I think getting a sales rep who is hungry, able to cold call and like barge into the back of house in the kitchen and really be that rep, which is what we need.
Ben, welcome to the pod. Really excited to have you here with us. And I know you just came back from Spain and Portugal and you were on your honeymoon.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
And 4 weeks is a long time for an entrepreneur, man. How did you survive?
Yeah, like it was the longest time I've ever taken off. And I think it was pretty good. I think the team did very, very well. I came back and everything was fine. So yeah.
That's a relief when you come back. You're like, oh, they can handle it. I need to calm down a little bit.
Yeah, I sort of walked in on Monday and I was waiting for a bunch of stuff that had kind of, maybe not, I'd picked up an email or Slack or whatever I was looking at while I was away and, what was hidden, and everyone was fine. Everyone was very relaxed. It was good.
It's a good sign, man. So to dive in, I think you're someone that's had a lifetime of experience in businesses and you were a founder by 24, which is pretty young to be in such a strong leadership position. You've successfully pivoted businesses and you've even sold businesses in the past. In your experience, what's harder, founding a business, pivoting a business, or selling a business?
I think founding a business is probably quite easy in the sense that you've got an idea, everything's blue sky, you're very excited, and really what you're thinking at that point is all the possibilities, everything that could happen. That's the fun part. The grind is the really hard part. So, and I think, selling it in a certain sense, you have your closure and you have, I guess the end of that particular part of the journey. So to answer your question, I think pivoting of those three is definitely the most difficult because you had that conviction, you had that excitement. It's wrong, or you suspect it's wrong. And you've got to A, accept that, and B, emotionally commit to a completely different direction with the resources you've got. And if you've got a team, you got to bring them on that journey now. Yep, I know that I've hired you for X and we're all on that mission. Actually, it's Y. And now we're going to do Y, and let's go do that. So I think that can be quite challenging.
Like handling the team's expectations and, predominantly people don't like a lot of change. So at that point in time when you were pivoting, like how big was the team and what was like the maneuver that you had to pull off?
Yeah, so the team we had was 7 at the time, but then we also had investors, which I would include as part of that team because all of the above had to really be taken on that journey and saying, I know that we were doing something and we're now going to do this completely other thing. And I think a lot of it was following the data. The data really spoke the truth to me. And then I think the more I was able to interpret that and kind of see the direction we should head in, then it was easier to bring the investors on board and easier to bring the team on because it wasn't just some fantastical idea that it had. It was actually really coming clearly through customer feedback, through sales. And so there were a lot of meetings, a lot of kind of, what about this, what about that? But yeah.
And I think for some business owners in that position, especially if it's their first experience, it might be difficult to navigate that. When you say data, like what are some of the things that you predominantly like to look at from a founder's perspective when pivoting a company?
I think the number one thing is customer retention or repeat purchases. I think, in our case, what we had built was a homemade food network and people could buy and sell food, sort of like Airbnb, but for food. And so people were posting food, Dane's cake, and some people would buy that cake, but would they buy it a second, third, fourth time? And what started happening is, restaurants, cafes, these sorts of customers were coming in. Not only were they buying it once or twice, but in higher volume. Sorry, not only were they buying it, but in higher volume and higher frequency. And the more we started looking at that, I said, well, hang on, people are voting with their dollars here. I think what was important for us in that case as well is we already had a technology platform that dealt with the concept of a seller, which was Dane, the person making the cake, and then the concept of a buyer, all right, which was just an individual. So we substituted, I guess, restaurants as the buyer and wholesale food suppliers as the supplier. We were able to kind of leverage off our existing tech. That was quite a big deal as well.
Do you find that there's an internal battle in some cases where, some founders have an idea and they can be too headstrong on said idea and maybe an unwillingness to look at the data? Did you have any of that internal conflict where you're like, I was really pursuing this idea and now this other thing's happening?
Yeah.
Like how difficult is it to, I guess, really shift yourself mentally and emotionally and operationally in that direction?
I think I'm very fortunate that my 2 co-founders, FoodByUs, are quite fluid and open, I think, to changing. We're also all very data driven. And so we were able to kind of look at the numbers and it kind of spoke for itself. There wasn't much I think, emotion in the room or kind of conviction that we all really wanted to change the world with homemade food. It was a good idea, and we kind of got investment, and it was enough to kind of, found the company. But ultimately, we wanted to do something that was helpful and successful, that people wanted, that they were voting with their dollars to say, yes, I want this again and again. And ultimately, I guess that kind of vision united us all. So it wasn't actually difficult or anything amongst the founders, but I count myself lucky as having the co-founders, because I could imagine what you're talking about happening very easily, that, the mission, vision, and reason we kind of did this is now changing. Why bother continuing, sort of thing.
So with FoodByUs, which is the business we're talking about,
Yeah.
and your founders, from what I understand, is they had experience in menu log as well. So
Yes.
they kind of had, seen the market in other avenues and other ways, and how consumers kind of behave and all the rest of it. And when you brought these founders together, was this at the very genesis of the idea? At what point did these guys come on?
Yeah. So we had all worked together, and Menulog had sold, and in the interim, Tim and Gary, my co-founders, and I were working on this other business. So I had kind of joined them, and whilst we were working on that, we kind of had this idea for FoodByUs. So we'd worked together. It was a data analytics company. We were sort of in that, and then this idea came about for FoodByUs, a sort of homemade food network, and we sort of talked about it, and eventually, took the plunge.
I like that you brought business partners in so early, and I think, our friend Dan Hakim was on the pod recently, who was the founder of Carbon Boa, and he was talking about how, in his perspective, it's almost more beneficial to have a business partner than it is to not have one, from his perspective. And for you, did you have any reservations about, collaborating with two other entities that had a wild myriad of success? Were there any things that concerned you at the beginning?
Not really. I mean, it's my second business, and my first one I also had a business partner. I think no one's brilliant at everything, right? And so I've always found partnerships is a really good way to just have someone on that journey. It's great. They truly understand what you're trying to do, and vice versa. They may be the only person who understands truly what's going on. But there's also obviously different skill sets and things that you can bring in. So, from my point of view, these were people I worked with. These were people I trusted. These were people who I think I had the same values as, but probably most importantly, we all had different skill sets. And I think that kind of made the partnership, a bit of a no-brainer.
You make a really good point there. We had Chris Do on the pod. I don't know if you're familiar with who he is, but he, ran an agency in the US called Blind, as well as did some projects with Microsoft Halo and Coldplay and a number of other things. And he was saying to us, like, one of the most important things in business is aligning your values. Yeah. Because I think when your values align, things become a lot easier. You're kind of looking at the world through the same lens, through the same perspective. Yeah. Were there points where it did get turbulent and you had to realign, or were you guys pretty rock solid from the onset?
I think because we'd had the benefit of working with each other for a few years. I would add another thing to that, actually. So I think you have to have very much the same values, but I think you have to have very much different skill sets.
Right.
Because part of, when you talk about, I guess, conflicts or getting through things in terms of the direction or whatever you want to do, part of having the same values is that you can have an open, honest conversation. That's great. But part of having different skill sets is that you'll come at the problem from a different angle, and it's very clear once you know the direction you want to head in, who does what. And I feel like if I had a similar or two similar skill set to my business partners, I'd want to do the coding, and they might want to do the coding, or we might argue about how to do the coding. I can't code. And that's very easy. So when it comes to a technical question, it's going to be Tim. And he's essentially led, the whole software development. But when it comes to a commercial question, equally he trusts me. Do we take this investor on? Do we head in this direction? Do we open up a new category or market? So I think, to answer your question, those kinds of conflicts, and I guess how it all kind of moves forward, can really sort itself out where you've got the values and the different skill sets aligned.
Yeah, it's like forced delegation or forced trust.
Yeah, like why would I pretend to talk about coding? It's just like a non-starter. So I think, you move very quickly as to what comes next.
Yeah.
And you get on with running the business, which is what you're all there to do.
What different pool of expertise did you guys bring together? Like, what were you guys working with at the beginning?
What, in terms of
skill-wise, yeah.
Yeah, well, Tim's, he's done software pretty much forever. So, building the platform and all that was him. I come from a business background, so I would say strategy, helping get investors, managing a team, all that stuff. And Gary's interesting because Gary's kind of got a bit of both. So he's both technical, but also has run businesses and was involved in Menulog and things like that. He's sort of like a sort of hybrid. And so I think he can be a good go-between sometimes, as to say, for example, Tim, that thing we want to do, it can't take that long because Ben needs it done sooner. It's commercial. It's important. But equally saying to me, Ben, that direction you want to take commercially, it's technically really hard. And so you can't just run off in that direction. It would take months or whatever to build, which I might not always get as a non-technical person. So that's kind of how we work together.
Yeah, you kind of cover each other's blind sides,
Yeah,
if you will. And for someone who's, let's just say, really technical minded and they could build a thing, or vice versa, they're very relationship oriented and they're not strong at tech, but
Yeah.
they're looking at potentially bringing a partner in. What's your advice to someone who's not got anyone within their proximity that they can bring in? Where should they kind of go to pursue a potential partnership?
I don't know, because the way it came about for me was that we'd worked together in the past. So I think that's a very important factor. So I know that there are meetups and, online communities and things like that where you can say, hey, I'm good at X and I need a partner who does Y, and do you want to go on this journey with me? I personally would never do that. I think one of the most important things in getting into business with the partners they've got is that we knew each other's skill set, we knew each other's work ethic, we trusted each other. So for me, it would be try and work with them, sort of try before you buy kind of thing.
Like dating.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's super important. Over and above that, I guess if it's a fresh first meet, it would come down to values, I think, more than anything else. Because the best skill set in the world, and however complementary you and this new potential partner are, if the values are different, it's just a non-starter. You kind of, it doesn't matter how brilliant you both are. I just think it falls apart so quickly.
I think that's a good point, because I was chatting to Dan about this yesterday on his podcast, which was that it takes about 15 hours to really have someone become familiar with you and become an acquaintance.
Right.
And if you're looking at bringing a partner into your business, it might be a sign that you should maybe integrate more into your kind of space or field of expertise, just so you can get to know people while you are incubating an idea potentially, and then have a bit more familiarity rather than bringing someone in cold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, I would never do it cold. I just, for me and in my experience and from what I think has worked for me, that's not something that I'd sort of be comfortable doing. It might work, but I haven't tried it.
And do you guys have any kind of exclusive process at points where you do clash horns? Has it been pretty seamless, or have there been moments and you've got a protocol that you go to?
It's interesting. I don't think we have a protocol that's necessarily sort of written down, but there's definitely things, I guess, principles that we might run the partnership by. One of those is, you can't leave anything seething or bubbling away underneath, because that's going to create angst, resentment, and, you're more likely to kind of potentially do something that the partnership hasn't agreed. So being upfront and saying, this has pissed me off, or whatever is I think thing number one. But then also after pretty upfront, robust discussion, once you agree, you agree. So another principle that we would, I think, live by in the partnership is you can't, for the benefit of this discussion and just being over it, because I don't want to talk about it anymore, say, yeah, cool, I agree, but go away and actually, action something different, because that's just going to break as well. So there's a couple of these sorts of things. We also like to say, I think data is the loudest voice in the room. So it doesn't really matter what you think, Dane, or what I think, because the reality is, like, we have, with the software company, just a plethora of data, and we should really be looking at that in the first instance, so that I don't have to convince you of my point of view. It should be really customers and so on that are kind of guiding the way. So these are kind of, I guess, like our toolkit. And then sometimes actually one other thing we do is we take the reverse side of what we're trying to argue just as an exercise. So if you're for it and I'm against it, let's swap. And I'll put all the arguments forward now against, why I'm now for it. It can be a bit contrived sometimes, because, you're kind of arguing a position that you didn't really ever think of. But it's a good exercise, I think, to think from the other person's perspective. So that's a kind of like toolkit.
That's really insightful. And I like the idea of swapping hats, just for the sake of exercising it. Yeah. And it could be a bit of a stress release as well, because then you're kind of realizing the ridiculousness of it, and it's kind of humorous in some way.
Yeah.
When it comes to the data, like something I just want to come back to a little bit here is there's a story I love about Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And at a certain point in time, I believe it was the 90s, I could be wrong here, he was selling books and CDs and records and things like that. And he did a survey and he sent out an email to about 1,000 people. And the question was, it was a really simple email. The question was, if I were to sell anything else, what would you buy from me?
Okay.
And he got an email back, and, a lot of people responded. And within those responses, he realized that we could sell anything. Right. Like people were asking for like windshield wipers, shoes, clothes, kitchen essentials. He was like, we could use this platform to literally be Walmart, essentially. And that one email and that one point of data completely pivoted the company that we know of today as Amazon. For you, were there a specific point that you were looking for that really drives that decision making? Because I can imagine you could look at data and make the wrong decision. Yeah. How do you know that data is legit? How do you allow data to be the loudest voice in the room?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one of the things with data, especially when you're in a very early stage, is that you don't have a lot of it. And so every little thing you're seeing could be an insight or could be a new direction. And so kind of every day you might think while you're kind of getting the idea going, yeah, I want to pivot in that way or that way. So I think repeat behavior is probably like one of the key things. But another is, I think, being really open to educating yourself about what you don't know about this product or industry. So what do I mean by that? With FoodByUs, it was a homemade food network. And then we started getting these cafes coming and buying as if they were people. And we would kind of shoo them away and say, we're not for businesses. After a while, a few kept buying, like they kept coming back. They wanted, locally made muffins and things like that. You can imagine how that would go in a cafe environment. So I called one of these cafe owners. I was like, why do you keep ordering, homemade muffins from our website? Like, I don't understand. You're a cafe. Don't you make that stuff yourself? And I remember this cafe owner saying, you don't know anything about how restaurants and cafes run, do you? We don't make a lot of our own stuff. We'll buy it in, or, we've got sort of pre-made stuff. And then over and above that, we've got all these other supply challenges. So that was a discussion and an education process. And I think what I'm trying to say is, where you've got not much data and it's early and the bits of data you're getting in might point you in one direction or another, I think it's about accepting your ignorance and saying, right, I'm just going to deep dive on this particular bit of data. It seems to be I've got a repeat purchase, seems to be coming from a cafe. Let me ask, let me see like what's going on. And it wasn't long before we worked out that lots of hospitality businesses have trouble with how they procure food. They have many, many different suppliers. This platform we've got, which is a marketplace of homemade food makers, could easily be, adapted for your fruit, veg, your seafood, whatever. But that educational process, and I think being open to it, was quite key. Because if we'd had our blinkers on and said, nah, this is homemade food, like do or die, well, yeah, I don't know where we'd be.
It's more of an investigative, journalistic approach. Like, let's just look into it.
Yeah, and I think a bit of humility in saying, I've founded this business, I've got investment, I've got, business partners, like tick, tick, tick. Actually, I don't know what's going on. It's too early stage. This thing could become anything. And it's just countless examples you hear about, of where people started with X and ended up with Y. Like Slack's my favorite example. They started building a computer game. They ended up with Slack, and things like that. So I think you've got to be very, very, very plastic in the beginning.
Apparently I heard somewhere that Airbnb once started as a cereal brand concept. Apparently.
Yeah. I think they actually they sold cereal boxes. It was like Obama O's and things like that, just to make ends meet while they were sort of trying to get Airbnb up and running. But yeah, it's a good example. I think of just being open to like in the beginning, whatever it takes.
Yeah. And it's a good point that you make there, because I think sometimes we can get caught up in our own hubris as a business owner. Like, we're so busy, this and that we really don't want to deep dive into the data. One of my favorite quotes is from a marketer named Mark Ritson. And he says, the first rule in marketing is that you're an idiot.
Right. Yeah.
And what he means by that is, try to get out of your own way and just look at what the consumer thinks.
Yeah, 100%. And I think keeping that fluidity is difficult, where you've put so much on the line to kind of get this going. But in the long run, it's good. And then I actually think it shifts as the business grows, where you become more and more and more, I think, narrow, where you've got an element of fluidity. But I think on the flip side, once you've found your product market fit and things start scaling up, that's a time to not pivot and move away from the new shiny thing, because I think that can hurt the business too. That's more later stage though.
Right, you can go too far.
Yeah, I think there's a point where, and I've seen this with my team, and people who've been with us for a while, and they say, oh, we used to do more, new projects and this and this and this, and now it's a lot of optimizing. And well, yeah, because now we're trying to get this thing to work, and we can't always go and jump and pivot here. We won't have a business. We'll be jumping around forever. So I think depending on the stage of the business, it can change.
When you look at the business stages, like you were just talking about, regarding there's like different seasons in business.
Yeah.
Have you ever read The E-Myth?
No.
It's a great book, and he touches on that there's like a lifespan in a business. And he talks about, the concept of a bakery. You might like baking pies, and you might be the best pie baker in town. And that's your passion. That's what you spend your weekends doing, and you do it because you love your family and so on. But then you open a bakery.
Right.
Now the role's very different because you've gone from passion to tactician, and now you've got an establishment. You've got to buy equipment. You've got to set up a display. You got to mop the floors, clean the ovens. And it's a very different situation. When you're an entrepreneur going through these different facets, and then above that is like, okay, then you become the manager, then you franchise multiple locations, and then you sell out, whatever it is. How do you look at businesses in stages when you're building them?
Yeah. I think that you have to accept that you're just sort of shedding your skin, like as the founder, and you become something new to that business as it moves into that new stage. So in the beginning, where there's not many hands on deck, you're the salesperson and you're the this and you're the that and you're sort of head of marketing and all these different role types. And it's fun and you get to do it all. You get to learn about everything from like AdWords to, how am I going to set up a CRM and whatever. As soon as you start hiring and growing and that part of the business, I think, becomes a bit more set or understood, you're not that thing. And you kind of got to pull yourself away from it, shed your skin again. Okay, what am I now? I'm now a manager. I've got to help this person and guide them. Da, 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 da. And then you kind of want to go into another city or you want to scale. Okay, what am I now? I'm now more an operational process person because I'm taking this thing we built in market A and I'm moving it over to market B. So, I'm not just sort of managing, but I'm really looking at how do we scale. And so if at each point you're happy to let go of what you were, even if you liked it, I love selling. For example, like I love getting on the road and I still try to do it and do a bit of a sale, but it's not really what I am to the business anymore. That's my head of sales job. And she's got, X many people reporting to her. I think it's really important and you owe that to the business. And I think as a founder, you can get stuck in what you like or the bit you don't want to give away or whatever it is. And you're actually doing a disservice to the business because you're not that thing anymore. That's not the value add at that point. And it's hard for founders because we've watched it grow from the beginning. So we can deep dive into any part of it often, but it doesn't mean you should. In fact, you shouldn't. So yeah.
It's a really good point. It's just knowing when to pivot, knowing when to change your hats, knowing when to kind of, shift gears as a business owner.
Yeah, to give it the most value, I think, because you've got to look at the business, I think, as much as it is part of you and it's wrapped up with your DNA, like it's your baby, is also accepting that it's its own entity and that your best way of helping and serving that entity might be at this point to step away from that particular thing or whatever. And yeah, as you said, I liked the idea of what you said in terms of stages and things like that. It's about understanding this thing has a life cycle. Yeah.
One of my mentors early on helped me with this particular challenge because I went to him and I said, I'm doing really well. My business got to a certain level, but I can't really seem to go beyond that. And he said to me, Dane, are you trying to restrict your cash flow and are you trying to protect? Are you changing gears into reservation and preservation versus pioneering and pushing? And I realized at that moment, I went from throwing everything I had into the business to then realizing we're making a lot of money here. Let's just calm down a little bit.
Right.
And he said, if the old you would just keep going, what would you do right now? And I said, I'd hire more people. I'd double down and I'd go back in. And I remember doing that, but I was terrified. How many times do you think people get stuck and it's more fear than it is their skill set?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think that it also, there's a lot in that, right? I think part of it is how are you as the founder, like you described? Like what is your mindset in that moment? Do you even want to grow? Are you restricting the business or are you sort of comfortable with where it's at? So I think there can be an element of fear in, I guess, confronting what is it that I want out of this thing and can I push it further? Should I push it further? But I also think that there are external factors as well in terms of the funding that the business might have, in terms of the, how much market opportunity is there still to go and things like that. And there, the fear might not necessarily be about an internal, you might want to grow, you might want to go as hard as you can, but it might be more about the what ifs, what are the external factors here? And, does this thing still have room to grow? So, and I think it's all those things. And it can be, and also, is the team ready for this? Like, do I have the kind of the resources and the tools I need to kind of affect this, even if I want to, and I think the macro environment is supportive, like, do we have what we need? So I think like my experience of those kinds of things is there's a lot in that, I guess.
There's a lot to unravel there.
There's a lot to unravel. And I think finding the truth of that is quite important because that can be often whether it is a good idea or whether it's just you kind of like accidentally pulling the handbrake without kind of meaning to. And I think a lot of that is, again, having your co-founders, having mentors. Like I love that you brought up you have a mentor. I think that's really key. And kind of not rushing to these kinds of decisions so you can get to the core element of like what might be the reason you do or don't want to take that direction. And so, you use the word fear, and I think that's a good word, but I think often it's kind of embedded in that. There's a lot of kind of elements going on. And I think, I've always sort of tried to keep, I guess, a good, close group of either mentors, friends, co-founders, whatever, where we can, at those moments, you really want to workshop it, I think.
When you seek a mentor for yourself, is there something that you try to seek? Are you trying to find someone who's been in your position down the road? Or do you like to think about it more, I want someone to challenge me and kind of really test my ideas? Like, what kind of relationship do you like in a mentorship?
Many different kinds, actually. So I think there's different mentors for different things. And part of being a mentee, I guess, is knowing who you might go to for what kind of problem. So some of them, for example, like my mentors might have run a marketplace business or one where there's sort of two sides and it's a technology-based thing. And so someone like that, I think, would really understand part of the scale journey and part of, just the inherent challenges with a business like that, even though it's in a different industry. But others, it might be a leadership or a kind of, just an experienced, seasoned business person sort of mentor relationship, where the challenge I might bring to them might not be, how do we scale? What's the operations behind blah, 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 but more, I'm having trouble with my leadership team, or I'm having trouble kind of motivating the team or motivating myself or whatever. So it's kind of like horses for courses. So I think in a mentor relationship, one is for me that I really respect them and there's a mutual respect, I think, that we kind of want to, go on this journey together on how we catch up. And it doesn't have to be formal, but I mean, that there's sort of at least an underlying sense that I'm being mentored and a commitment to that. But then the other is their skill set and their experience and how it kind of feeds into the problems I'm having of the day. And so, yeah, it really depends. But I in my experience, a formalized mentor that I've sought out and there's only one of them, that's not how I would do it. I think it's a bit too structured and a bit too, limited in terms of what you can really get. So I've kept a number of different mentors over the years and it evolves depending on where I'm at and where they're at.
I like that you look at it from a perspective of, it's good to have a few, it's good to have different mentors for different things. Like right now I have a mentor in my life who's really centric on scalability and how to kind of leap outside of the size of the business we're at now. So we're at 30 people and the conversation is how do we get to 60 to 90? And we're having those very tactical conversations
which many years ago, you probably couldn't have even had the conversation.
No.
So that mentor, like I often view mentors as like, it's a thing to be unlocked. And when you're ready, you can unlock a lot of the experience.
Like a video game, it's like the next stage.
Exactly. And there's a wiseness, right? In a mentor, I mean, that's really why you're going to see them. They've got wisdom to impart. Now, if you're a team of two and you're having conversations about getting to 60 people, maybe it's a premature conversation. And then you're not ready, I guess, as a mentee for that.
You're not ready for that level of video game yet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, right? And so, yeah, I think what you said, like it's really true, right? Is you both need to be at that right stage. Yeah.
Yeah. And for you, you talked about one of your greatest strengths is, relationships and sales and like consumer-centric marketing. And when you talk about consumer-centric, I think some people get a little convoluted of what that really means.
Right.
When you talk about a consumer-centric mindset, really unpack that. What exactly is that?
Yeah, I think in FoodByUs, it's really important to understand that we are an outsider looking in. And what I mean by that is we were a software company that's really learned an insight about how restaurants and cafes order their food, which is that it's quite complicated and very difficult to get reporting and all the things that really go to the profitability of that restaurant. So that's the insight. And then I think at the same time, I've never run a restaurant. I don't think I've even worked in a restaurant, so having that insight is, I think, very different to being able to help them in the right way. And so when we talk about, I guess, consumer-centric, it's really about being unbelievably humble and knowing how ignorant my team and I really are about being able to predict what the solution is and really understand the problem. So what do we do? Constantly talking to chefs, owners, suppliers, like everyone in the industry, like really sitting there observing how do you do your ordering? And if you're a supplier, how do you run your trucks and when do you pick and pack your items? So for me, I guess in a word, consumer-centric, or in my case, customer-centric being the businesses I'm trying to help, is about education. I know we can build great software. I know we can do a really, really good job of helping, but it's about, for me, deep diving into exactly understanding the problem. And in understanding the problem, then unlocking, everything, how we communicate, what the actual solution is. I mean, a really good example is chefs work really late at night. Often English is a second language. They're not super tech savvy by reputation. And so everything about how we communicate, when we communicate, what the software does, like how easy the interface, like it all comes out of that, right? But that's come from like a learning and kind of teaching journey. Yeah.
I think it's a really good position to take, is just really going out of your way to talk to these people. When someone has, let's just say, a profit-centric mindset, can that get in the way of interfering how people might approach these conversations?
I think every business needs to make profit. So I would say it's core to every business. But what I think the danger, I think that's what you're getting at, is when that trumps what's really going to serve the customer, and perhaps you take a short-term view instead of a long one. Because when that happens, whilst I guess it's sort of tempting as a business owner, or you might have external pressures on you to kind of make a decision in that way, in the long run, you'll pay. You'll pay because you have a ultimately less suitable product for your customer, and they'll just vote with their feet. And so there are many times in software for chefs, which is really what we do, where there's corners to cut and there's ways we could do it that's kind of, we get it to market a bit quicker, and maybe it makes us a bit more profit in the short term. But I can't think of a time we've done that, and it's kind of, and we haven't had to come back and, you know, revamp it or whatever.
And with FoodByUs, can you think of an actual example recently where the data really informed you on a very key business decision when you were listening to the consumer, other than the ones you've touched on?
I think, you know, we've just launched an app, and I think that there's an interesting story about part of why we did that. So our website works really well on a mobile, to the point where, from like, again, we're outsiders looking in, it's almost synonymous. Like how it's going to interact, how you're going to interact with us via an app is pretty much the same as on a mobile. But then I guess when we spoke to our consumers and you talk about the data, you know, a lot of them just think app first. Like chefs are just like, well, where do I get it? Where's the app? Like, where is it in the app store? And then more than that, as you kind of dig deeper, websites need that live connection to the internet. And a lot of chefs will go to their storeroom or a freezer, and as they're looking at what their inventory is, that's when they're plonking their order into the system. No internet in there, the website's not going to work. Suddenly FoodByUs is useless. Whereas on an app, you can kind of save it to the actual device, and then when the internet comes back on, you can little things like that. And we started to realize, hang on, we think, you know, the website and a potential app is synonymous, but actually, you know, in the minds of the consumer, there are some quite key differences. And it's just a small example, but I think it's like yet another one where how we build it and the interfaces and the way we think about it as being pretty much like for like, it's just, that doesn't matter, you know. And if you ask enough chefs and you go around, then actually you realize like the thing that they want. So that I think is just one small example, but there are many other cases like that, and all the features we've built and all the, I guess, the way we've approached product design. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting one. At like what point did you realize that? Was it through a conversation, or did it come up a few times in feedback?
I think it was honestly just constantly going in and watching what they do, talking to them about how they run their business. So I try to get on the road with one of the sales reps at least once a month. I'll just shadow them. I think they hate it. I love it. They're like, why is the CEO kind of shadowing me? But it's a way for me to kind of see how they interact with customers and do so with myself. And part of onboarding at FoodByUs, if you're a new staff member, doesn't matter if you're a web developer or a data analyst or in marketing, in your first few weeks, you will go on the road with a rep once or twice just to follow them. So what I'm trying to say is it's important for me as a CEO, but it's important on everyone at FoodByUs that you do see and watch and have these interactions, because how the hell otherwise are you going to know that the importance of an app is because when you're in a freezer, the internet cuts out? Like there's just no way, I think, to get to those kinds of insights without really observing the customer. And yes, you can do surveys and whatever. There's all different ways that you can interact to get that. But I think there's always things you'll miss if you don't, you know?
Okay, so the idea of sending your new employees on the road to, you know, shadow the sales team.
Yeah. They don't have to sell, but they have to shadow.
That's interesting, because I remember when I worked at an insurance company here in Australia called UE Insurance, at that point in time when I worked there, the only way you could get into claims or any of the other divisions inside of the company was if you first and foremost went through the sales division.
Okay.
And even if you were dismal at selling, that's fine. At least you've dealt with it. You know what you're experiencing. So then when you move into another department, you've got that perspective.
Yeah.
I always wondered what was the real impact of doing that. It sounds like you're very consciously doing that. So what's the reason and what's the benefit?
I think it's really just about understanding the industry that we operate in. I mean, I had a sales rep go into a kitchen during lunch service, which is a terrible idea, and tried to pitch FoodByUs, and the chef threw a potato at his head and he scampered out, you know, and he never did that again. But the point is, you got to understand that, you know, and it's a funny story, but at the same time, even if you're a data analyst and you're kind of trying to understand the, I guess, way that the network operates between the two sides, you've just got to see and live and breathe the environment. Again, it's all part of the philosophy as I see it, of we're outsiders looking in. We know we're really good at building software. That is our core competency, but that's not enough. You know, we've got to kind of get what we're trying to solve here. And that's it. It's sort of not much more than that. I go out on the road like I said, once a month because I think it's important for me to always have my finger on the pulse. But, for the team, I think it's all right as part of onboarding.
Has there been an obvious benefit within the holistic team? Because I'd imagine it would create a bond. It's like we've all been on the road. We've all seen some
100%.
potatoes thrown at people's heads.
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. That doesn't happen too often, thankfully. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think what happens then is we're talking about customers' needs and things like that. And the rest of the team, I think, intuitively gets what's going on out there. And it does create a bond, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just really interesting. And it's like got me thinking about, how we can implement that somehow.
Yeah, right.
You've had a lot of success building multiple businesses in different spaces and different industries, different disciplines. For me, how do you remain so decisive in the event where it might blow up in your face and it might go sideways? Like, how do you deal with that conflict? Because a lot of business owners are facing big decisions day after day.
Yeah.
And my thesis is you kind of have to get through them and just move on, right?
Yeah.
But people fixate and they get stuck. Like what's been your relationship with decision making?
I think for me at least, you have to make a few really bad decisions and realize it's going to be okay. And then I think that really enables you to take a line, stick to it until it breaks, and then kind of trust that it'll be okay. And that happened a lot in my first business. It was just like bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. And then slowly I learned. And I think at that age and stage, it was sort of good to play around and kind of make a lot of really big mistakes and then learn from that. And so now, like later on, I think I've sort of learned there might be fear or there might be insufficient data or there might be things that can go wrong. But ultimately, it's all right because I've seen things go wrong before and it always ends up fine. So probably my favorite thing about business is you always get a second, third, fourth chance at the thing you're trying to do. And so like it doesn't have to be perfect day dot. Yeah.
What were some of the bad decisions that you made in FoodByUs that went other than the potato situation?
Oh yeah. Gosh, so many. I think often it's when I've rushed and just thought, yeah, I'm onto this, and we're just going to kind of roll this out. So in the beginning, when we were connecting suppliers into restaurants, often the supplier wants to drop the food off like early in the morning. That's when they'll do the run. The restaurant's totally closed. So to help affect this, we wanted the restaurant to leave a key, out the front so the supplier can unlock and drop the food off. And that's not just going to happen leaving a key on the street. You need like a lockbox or that kind of idea. There are plenty of mechanical, big metal lockboxes at Bunnings that you can just buy. And that would have been fine with like a mechanical code or whatever. And that is ultimately the decision that we went with eventually, but I'll tell you what we did first. I thought, got to be cool to kind of we're a tech company. We can build software around this. And we found these Bluetooth software-driven lockbox things. They were meant for Airbnb. And you can send a code to the driver and the driver punches it in. The code changes every single time. Then it unlocks just for a few minutes. You use the key, you come back, you put it back in. And how great's that? So we went and bought 100 of these just fancy Bluetooth lockbox things. Instructed the devs to build a whole sort of system around how we generate a unique one-time code through this lockbox system and send it to the supplier, and off they go. It was a disaster. I mean, these things, the battery life was terrible. If it rained at all, they broke. And moreover, the suppliers didn't even have the capability when we would send them this unique code to give it to the driver, who it was 2 a.m., may have been a contractor, and had zero interest in punching in this 9-digit unique code so that they could access the venue. And yeah, we threw all those lockboxes out. It was a ton of wasted time from a web development point of view.
Yeah.
But, that kind of became like law within the company. And for years after, I haven't heard it in a while, but for years after that, people would say, remember the lockbox, Ben? Like remember that time that we did that? Should we think about this more? Like, is this the complex solution first before we get to the simple one?
It's a bit of a code word just to throw it out in your face.
Think twice. Lockbox. Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's just funny and slightly true to talk about it now because it was such a bad decision and we were so excited by the tech and all that we could do that we kind of forgot. The whole point at 2 a.m. when you're dropping off this thing is to just get the driver to unlock the venue, get in, get out. And a mechanical thing was just fine. It wasn't battery powered. And that's ultimately what we did. So yeah, I think that's like one example, but I think it's a good analogy of just times where founders have just, doubled down on something really cool and just blew up in my face. Yeah.
I like your perspective on, it's not the end of the world. You have multiple chances, multiple lives with the decision, and you can just reset.
Video game analogies.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know why. I don't even play video games anymore. But, so on the other side of this, like what is a problem that you've solved that you're personally really proud of, where you're like, we nailed that. That just went flawlessly.
Yeah. So when a restaurant orders from a supplier, that's the outbound order, it's a purchase order. But what they really want back is the invoice from that supplier, because that's going to tell you what was actually delivered, the final price, like all this information. Super helpful. We need to get that into the system. And how we went about solving that, I think, was really, really clever, because again, as a software company, we often want to build it ourselves. It's fun, it's exciting. Devs get really like, yeah, we can solve this. But I think what we did really cleverly there is we looked in the market at a number of different new technologies, including AI, where we said, right, what can we adapt that's out there, which is going to let us achieve this? How is it going to scale? Like we really thought through, I think, that amazing balance between what I might call the digital lockbox solution and all the fancy stuff, which we kind of, I think we're geared towards as a software company, as an innovative company, but then like tempered that really, really well to say what is currently on market and how do we do this within a time frame. So we defined the sort of technology we wanted to use. We tested it really, really well, but we also set artificial timelines for ourselves to say, if this takes longer than a few months, we're not going to do it. So I think it was a real summation of what we as a team have learned at FoodByUs in terms of getting the balance just right between innovating and doing some terrible loss decision where actually you've gone too far, or on the other hand, sticky taping it together where you haven't done enough. And that was really, really sort of good, proud moment for the team. And the technology that we've built and how it's working now is just great. Like it's one of these great examples where from beginning to end, we feel we nailed it. Yeah.
When you started building this particular business, and I like how you just referred to like there's a Goldilocks zone, you can go,
yeah, exactly,
too ragtag, and you can go too fancy. You just got to kind of find the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Particularly in the tech startup space, so many people don't survive. They have a great idea, they put a team together, they invest a lot of capital, they get capital, and then it just kind of dissipates and they're stuck. What were your initial concerns with this particular industry before you started around the technology?
I should have had concerns that I didn't, but I think very early on, I'll say, it kind of became apparent how little technology had penetrated what we call the back of house, or the kitchen and the ordering process. And I think there's an assumption as a consumer that you go to a restaurant and maybe there's QR ordering, or you've used a delivery app or any number of things, or you see them punching in your order into a sort of fancy point of sale system, and it all looks very digital and nice. It's not really happening at the back of house. I guess that's part of why we exist. And so that learning, which came quite early, I think was something we really had to adjust to and change everything in terms of the language we use, the level of complexity that we build around, and even, I guess, what we think the industry is ready for at this stage. So that was definitely something that I think it was a bit of a shock to really understand where things were at with some of these businesses, and then also take the view that that's okay. That's where we're at. Our job's to help them, and we're not going to change it overnight. So kind of, I think, being patient and going on that journey. But yeah, it's definitely a bit of a wow in the beginning.
Yeah, I think, from the tech startup companies that we've talked to, it does feel more like a fly by the seat of your pants in the startup phase, because technology, there's an idea component, there's the coding, there's the interface, there's the consumer, then what the consumer really wants versus what we think. It just seems like it's a very adaptive space to kind of work in. Are there some concepts within the tech startup space, like things that people should really think about before really, crawling into that space and building a business?
There's a really good interview with Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, which talks about this. And I think it's so key to your point, which is there's a lot going on in the beginning, and you've just got to get, I think it's 10 or 100 people who love your product. It is mission number one in the beginning. Like, how do I get people to buy this and rebuy it and tell their friends? And I think that focus in the beginning is so critical. And so what you spoke about, which is there's a lot going on and you can pivot, and there's all these kind of mixed signals from your team, your co-founder, investors, customers, whatever. I think sometimes founders want to find the big thing first, i.e. how do I scale this to be massive? I want to be the next whatever, TikTok. And so it's like some big thing, right? Often without, I think, understanding that that is a totally different business challenge, and it's a second stage thing to just, how do I get 10 people to tell their friends about my product? And we have always focused on the former, and I've sort of given examples of that where we've just focused on the data and said, what's the repeat purchases like? What's kind of the referrals like? Like, how are people engaging with what we're trying to build here to a point where the signals look pretty good? And I think for us in the beginning, every time we kind of moved away from that, it would just be either expensive or time consuming, and ultimately probably wouldn't result in something that can scale to the future. So yeah.
Well, like you said there, it's the first 10 or 100 that are the priority.
Yeah.
And we talk to a lot of, people that are starting technology brands, and they have these grandiose ideas. But I like your point about like just redact it back to like what's going to get us a win right now.
Yeah.
Which is, how do we, in the shorthand, actually have a collective of people fall in love with us?
Yeah.
Within that, what's your advice to people around how they should target? Because if you're trying to get 100 people to fall in love with you, it's a lot easier to be very niche versus trying to have your big, grandiose, broad appeal.
Yeah.
Do you think that in the technology space, people should buckle into being very niche in the very beginning and just solve one problem really well? Like, what's your frame of thinking around that?
Yeah, I think that it's easier and more focused for a business to try and get those 10 or 100 sort of raving fans where it is niche. It's incredibly hard, I think, if you think about what you're trying to achieve just in that first little bit, and the fact that you want people to really fall in love. Like, how can anyone fall in love with just a broad concept of, it's a car or it's a whatever, like this, it's a sort of a product that you've known or heard of with a little bit of a difference, as opposed to like, it's this really cool, like, new thing and it only does this. And this is kind of what I'm offering to you. And you may absolutely hate it, but at least have elicited, I guess, a response that, yeah, that's a no vote for that. But equally, when you get that yes vote, because it's such a niche, specific concept, it's going to be a really loud yes vote. And from there you can build out, and okay, maybe some people want it in this color or that color or this version or whatever. But that's your kind of stage 2, 3, 4 kind of audience. If the purpose is to get feedback and really nail your business concept in the beginning, like, why wouldn't you go niche? Because that's going to drive people to say, I love this or I hate this. Great. That's the feedback you need.
So it's easier to get data and insights from a niche audience than chasing too many different audience types.
Well, I think also in terms of the concept, like if the concept is a bit vanilla or broad, you're not going to know why people do or don't like it. And so that's not going to help you, I think, as a founder. And so like for us, like a good example is with homemade food. It was too broad of a concept. It's homemade food. It's food that you can buy from your neighbor. So we'd have people buying and sometimes repeat buying, often not enough repeat buying. Was it that they didn't like that dish? They didn't like the concept, whatever. Like it was very much, wading through, I think, a lot of disparate data because the concept was quite broad. And then once we started looking at it's just for cafes. In fact, the first thing we looked at was baked goods for cafes, muffins and things. Like it went
very specific.
Yeah, it went from quite broad to quite narrow very, very quickly. And then we'd be out pitching just cafes saying, do you want muffins and bagels and things like that? Very, very narrow. And but that's where we started getting our traction. And it wasn't for a while that we started offering meat and seafood and fruit, veg and all these other things. Like it grew from there. But
how important is that, right? Because sometimes people try to go too broad too quick. And we have, a saying that we have here around Rival, which is if you try to appeal to everyone, you appeal to no one.
That's exactly, I think that's way better phrase than what I'm trying to say. So you said it in way less words, but I think...
But that's what you're doing, right?
I think that's it, yeah.
We got traction with the baked goods.
Yeah.
Crushed that. And then I imagine the same partners were like, hey, do you also do...
Exactly. And I think you're looking for the same behavior again. So you asked, okay, well, how do you know how to expand, beyond that? Is this new thing we want to add in a good idea? And it's the same behavior you're looking for. Now, instead of just baked goods, we're offering baked goods and fruit veg. Do we see the repeat? Do we see all the same things? But now it's baked goods, fruit veg, and insurance.
What?
Okay, why? So now we're not seeing people, but all right, that probably wasn't. Yeah, exactly. So I'm giving, obviously it's a silly example, but the point is, I think at each edition, you kind of want to see that it makes sense to the customer and that they're continuing with that same, I guess, voting with their dollar behavior.
When you said you got traction, like what particularly happens? Like, was it, okay, we got a lot of repeat buyers. Now all of a sudden they're putting an order in every week. Like what was the data you saw there?
Repeat buyers, higher average order and frequency of those orders, and referrals. You
became talk of the town.
Yeah. Well, not quite that, but definitely we'd have, I heard of you guys through my friend who runs a cafe, and that's okay, cool. No one is coming into our homemade food side of the business because their friend told them or whatever. It was always through AdWords or like some cost to the business in terms of how we advertise to them. And then maybe they'd try it and, not repeat enough. So I think that was just like a huge vote of confidence. And yeah, at one point, if you came to FoodByUs shortly after we founded, the site was actually split in two. And it was like go left for homemade food, go right for wholesale sort of thing. And then eventually we just, canned the homemade food. But yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think, this reminds me of one of Simon Sinek's talks where he talks about, the law of definitive innovation. And he touches on the early adopters and how important that is in business to really master the early adopter. And in his words, it's the people who just get it. It's the cafe owner who goes to your website and goes, why doesn't this exist? This is great. Yeah. I'm in. I'm all in forever. Yeah. How important is it to have that early adopter proof of concept before you go too wide, too aggressive, and try to do too many things?
Early adopters are amazing because they're the people that really make you think, I can do this. There's a market here, right? I also think they're a bit dangerous because often they're the innovators within their industry. They're looking for what's cool and what's new. And so because of that, they may muddle through some pretty bad UX. They may muddle through an experience that isn't ideal. They like being early adopters. It's part of who they are. So I think they're really important to understand that you're onto something. I don't think they're necessarily the right people to help you scale what that thing is. They tend to have just a higher tolerance for like not such a good part of the business. So what we've always tried to do, I think, is use early adopters for that new fancy thing. So like I spoke earlier about expanding from, say, baked goods into fruit, veg and whatnot. That might be a question you ask early adopters. Would you be interested in that? Like you're almost conceptually testing. Do you want insurance with this? No. Okay, cool. We're not going to do that. But, what would you think if we did A, B, and C? And they become kind of like almost like a product committee where you kind of want to test some of these like bleeding edge ideas, but you want to be we are really careful about listening to them when it comes to how the thing should actually work at a scaled way. It's a totally different thing.
And then around that, and also in your industry, when it comes to new technology that people might not have seen before or used before, how do you deal with educating the marketplace? How do you make sure that they understand what they're looking at, why they should do it? Yeah.
That is, it's probably the number one challenge for FoodByUs because we're selling two things. One is it's digital. It's a digital way of doing your business.
How were your clients doing it before you?
So most of the industry still does it through individual ordering methods, which would be WhatsApp, email, phone calls.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
It's not. What I'm about to say is a normal way for some suppliers to take an order. The chef will call after hours. There's no one there at the supplier's business. There's just a one-way voicemail, and the chef will read the order down the line. And at about 2 a.m. the next day, someone will come in and push play and transcribe all of what has been ordered from all the different chefs and pop that into the system, and off that goes for delivery. So that's normal. Like that's a way that some people still take orders, which we see as kind of like, okay, that there's room for change there. So I think shift number one in educating is it's digital. You're going to unify all your ordering. That's probably the hardest part of educating. I'll get back to how we do that in a minute. But then the second is, here's our solution. Like this is how FoodByUs as a platform is going to help you in that digital journey. You can have all your invoices scanned in. We integrate with Xero, MYB, blah, 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 blah. But you can't even have that discussion. And one of the mistakes, some of our new sales reps make is they might jump to that part two in the beginning. And the chef is like, hang on, like what? Like this is too much. So how do we educate about that first step into that digital realm? I think is often there's a sense of maybe fear or uncertainty from the chef. They've heard about how this all happens, but they like it their way, or they like being in control, or whatever. It's anything that a normal consumer of a new product might feel like, this is new and different, I'm uncertain. So a lot of what the reps in that stage of the interaction is a coach and a teacher. And a lot of it is not about selling, but saying, I am here, I'm a human, I'm here I'm able to kind of show you around, help you save the app on your phone, like things like that. Like it's really about, I guess, getting that trust that we are going to take you digital, point one, and we're going to try and help you do that. And point two, here's how you use FoodByUs and all that, all the bells and whistles. So I think getting a sales rep who is hungry, able to cold call and like barge into the back of house in the kitchen and really be that rep, which is what we need, but combined with a very calm, patient teacher is how we hire our sales reps, and is a very big, I think, a challenge for us because it's those two things are often not together.
Yeah, because I imagine, a kitchen environment one of my friends, Paul Ash, shout out to Paul, runs a hospitality business called Dojo, and he, was describing to me that when chefs are in the kitchen, it's called a brigade for a reason.
Yeah.
They're at war, and the last thing they want to deal with is some sales rep barging in
and
and
throw a potato at you.
yeah, they're going to cop a potato or two, right? And when it comes to your business model, I think I love how you have, what I would call a BDM or someone who's on the road, and dude, a lot of tech startups don't see sales the same way.
Okay.
Right. I love the approach that you're actually sending people out on the road, essentially door knocking, dropping in, building relationships and doing the hard yards, doing the grind.
Yeah.
How did that really get its legs? Because I imagine that's a bit of a slog in the beginning to get enough people out there getting the word around town to generate enough revenue.
Yeah. I think that I'm probably biased in that because I love selling. So how it got its legs was honestly, I would go out and sell. I still try to do that. Like I said a minute ago, I really just enjoy doing that. And I think from there, it kind of expanded out into, we need a team and so on to do that. That's part one of it. But I also think it's the way the industry does things. So when you look at any suppliers into these restaurants, they've got reps and it is, I think, the common way of interacting. Now you can do it through advertising and AdWords and all these different things, but it's generally less effective than just, for the reasons you described in terms of their operating environment. Nothing's quite as effective as just getting face to face, particularly when you're saying, hey, Dane, you never met me before, but I want you to change your entire procurement process and go digital. That's not a conversation you want to have via email. So yeah.
It's a really good point. And I think there are some business models that perhaps couldn't survive in this space had they gone the social media advertisement route or the SEO route or what have you. Do you have a scalability version of this where it's like, we want our sales reps to penetrate the market, build awareness, gain a reputation, so much so that then people start looking for us?
Yeah, I think it scales through referrals and things like that. And it also scales through our supplier partners. So in the beginning, we'd have suppliers come onto the network. They upload their pricing and things like that. Because whilst we help venues procure their food, we also do offer them other options if they ever want to sort of dip into the marketplace. So the business has a few different elements. Now, in the beginning, the suppliers were all a bit dubious, like what is this? Do I want to upload my pricing and just have randoms buying from me? But over time, they've seen that we drive new business, that we're helping the restaurants order in a better digital way, and that helps the suppliers too. So now the scale part of it comes from our suppliers, and we've got a core group of about 100 from alcohol, seafood, whatever, who are saying, hey, this lead, I would rather just go through FoodByUs. It's going to be easier for me as a supplier. I know FoodByUs is going to treat the customer well, and off that goes. So that kind of journey, I think, has taken a while, and you've really got to prove yourself in a two-sided marketplace. But I think that's part of how we found we have scaled, because you can't door knock forever with, unless you've got just hundreds and hundreds of these people, which we don't. You really have to find that key to unlock some of the scale.
Now, while this is taking place, you're building relationships on the ground. That ripples out into the community for referrals, and then I'm sure that those waves keep rippling out to more and more referrals. The suppliers are spreading the word around town, like everyone's doing their little bit.
Yep.
What else are you doing from the branding perspective on top of this face-to-face type strategy?
Yeah, I think if I go back to the challenge of sort of, there's FoodByUs as a platform, which is the second part of the sell, but then there's, hey, you could go digital. A lot of the branding comes from, I think, getting over that first part. So then we'll use things like case studies to really show like examples of where this has kind of worked. And we're really trying to, I think, walk the line, and it's a hard line to walk, between there is a better way of doing what you're doing without making anyone feel like, hey, like, why are you doing this? Why are you barking your order down a one-way voicemail? Like that's silly sort of thing. So you definitely don't want to sort of come in as an outsider and act like you know better. So these case studies, I think, are real people talking, and it's a real example where we're just educating based on clear benefits from a user without. So what we won't do, for example, with the branding is we don't talk about stats like, did you know, and this is true, but something like 15% of orders, there's a transcription error. And so that's likely to lead to the wrong thing getting delivered. But why would we lead with that to an industry that's already kind of like, who are you and you're an outsider? So there's we don't do the stats. We don't do that kind of, pushing to them at like, there's a smarter way and you need to know how. It's more collegial than that. And then I think the other thing we do from a brand is like, it's all very authentic and literal. Like the brand is FoodByUs. It's not like
It's not cryptic.
It's not like DigiProcure or some like you know, random thing like that. So it's very much like, hey, like we're here as a group to help you with your food and how you order it. And the branding on the website is very like clear and kind of we don't use words like marketplace or digital procurement, like none of these things you would find.
So you're not using, you know, and this is a challenge.
Bamboozle anyone, you know.
Yeah, this is a challenge a lot of brands have is they'll use their own lingo. Yeah, wherein, you know, chefs in the kitchen, you know, they're not speaking that way.
No, it's to them it sounds kind of not authentic, and also like you're trying to kind of pull one over them. So it's more likely to scare them away. So very much about industry case studies, very much about showing how it's worked with others, and then also very clear, very simple, very like literal language. Like it's not an aspirational brand or anything like that. It's very much like we're here to do a job, and we want to help you, you know, be the best venue you can be.
I just love your approach to business and how you see this and how you're, you know, really looking at the data and building relationships, and you have a very long-term thinking plan as well as a short-term, you know, campaign that you're running. For you, you sound like someone who's like really well-versed in business. What are some books that have helped craft your methodology?
Yeah, there's a lot, all with different, I think, like stages, you know, for where I'm at.
If someone's in the very beginning stages of doing something like what you're doing, what would be some go-to books to kind of help people think about, okay, the sales process, you've got to think about the consumer, you have to think about building the technology in a very adaptive way, these kind of problems?
I think one book I often recommend to people is called 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. He was one of the PayPal co-founders. And the idea is from 1 to infinity, it's a question of scale. Like if you're the next version of that thing as a business, it's just a little bit easier and a little bit, I think, of a different challenge to just grow that.
Rather than thinking about the whole big, crazy
so what is $0
billion buyout thing?
Yeah. So what is 0 to 1? 0 to 1 is that kind of initial stage of saying like, this is a new concept and I'm originating it as a founder. And that's what the book's about. So I think it really articulates, I think, just super clearly like how you might think about this idea that you've got and the various parts about the market you're in, the need that you're really fulfilling, you know, how you might scale it down the line. And it's not a long book, and I think it just cuts straight to the chase of saying, with quite like a hard lens, is this something that can go from like nothing to one? And then that is your challenge in the beginning. And I think it's tempting as a founder to think, wow, like all I need is, you know, 10 million users or whatever, and we're fine. Okay, how are you going to get one? How do you get one user? And I think that reframing of it is the book does really well.
Are there also some key people that you really look up to in this space that are maybe producing content or media that people can digest?
It changes. I mean, like there's just so many podcasts out there that I could recommend, but I think a lot of it is like, I find it depends like what mindset you're in and what stage you're in.
Let me throw you a mindset.
Yeah.
Because we see this happen a lot. And especially in the technology space, people are very optimistic in the beginning. They're really enthused by their idea. They're zealous. They want to get it done. They're pumped. And it's usually their first or second attempt, and seldomly have they had your backgrounds of success. Right. So they're very much dealing with not quite yet having the instinct. Let's just say that. They don't have the inherent instinct. They're kind of playing from a place of, this is all new to me and I got to figure this out.
Yeah. Okay. I hear you. I think, let me give a few. Because like the reason I'm hesitating is because there's just so many.
It's a complex question. Yeah.
I think there's a lot out there. So we're talking about what podcasts and things or content that I'd recommend.
Well, people just to, I guess, seek out from, like, you know, for example, in my industry, I love Marty Neumeier because he's kind of a connoisseur of branding. He worked a lot with Steve Jobs and Apple, and, you know, he's got some good books and some good courses and programs I've done, which were really helpful to me in my space. Simon Sinek's been really helpful to me, as well as like Seth Godin. Right, there's like these, almost like these characters that you can kind of draw inspiration and information from. And I'm just wondering if in the, you know, the tech startup space, if there's like a place where there's, you know, a lot of rich resources that people can kind of dive into. Yeah,
I think, just speaking for myself, I think the environment and landscape, I think, of a startup is often changing. And so I don't know that there's sort of what I might call more, more what's going on today podcasts in terms of news and things like that. Like there's This Week in Startups, and there's all in and all these different things. But what you're talking about, which is I think someone who wants to start the journey, I probably wouldn't go towards like the news and the currency ones, only because that can seem quite intimidating and difficult to kind of follow what's exactly going on. And often they're very macro. I think one of the most important things is to understand the journey. So for that, often I would read, I read a lot of biographies. I think it's really interesting to understand how these people kind of came to their idea. Walter Isaacson's done a great biography on Steve Jobs. He's also done one on Elon Musk, which is, I think, not as good, but it's just interesting, I think, from like a biographer's point of view, okay, how these things kind of got through. And then another one is a long form podcast called Acquired, which is like a 4-hour deep dive on big companies around the world, like they've done Louis Vuitton or Visa or Microsoft. And I think what's cool about it is they really go into like how these things came about. Like everyone knows Visa, Microsoft, whatever, but it's how these founders kind of, I guess, built it and how long it took and how many ways it could have gone wrong. The Microsoft one, which I just listened to, is so interesting. Like how many times Bill Gates just could have like botched the whole thing and how they kind of muddled their way, through to what we all know Microsoft is today. I personally think those are the things to listen to because tactics and all that short-term stuff and what's going on in news is not really probably going to save you from your particular challenge and what's going on. But I think having a mindset of grinding it out and knowing longevity-wise that it's not a linear journey, that it's a big squiggly line, I would recommend. But that's just speaking for me.
I like that though, because I think, for me, you can read these tactical books and you can gain skill sets and all those things which are helpful.
Yeah.
But it's almost like you have all these tools and without the right mindset, the tools are almost useless, right?
I think the tools are helpful, but you don't necessarily know how they might apply to your situation. And often the tools in their attempt to be helpful can date really quickly. And I often think, well, in my experience, you learn the most from trial and error. So the mindset of being comfortable trialing and erroring, I think is, for me, more important than a really good academic theory gleaned from podcast, books, or whatever, which I then know I can apply. Don't get me wrong, that stuff can help you cut corners and avoid making mistakes, but ultimately it's going to go wrong in some way. And so better you have, I think, in the back of your mind, like this is what happened at Visa or Master, whatever, and I'll be okay too, is probably more helpful than reading 20 books, applying a particular sales methodology, it breaks, and you're like, now what? I did all the study I could, and I did all the tactics I could, and it didn't work.
It all didn't work. Now what?
So what? Like, okay, like try something else, Yeah.
There's a lot of power in autobiographies, and I've read a lot. And, for me, it's like, where else can you get 20, 30, 40 years of experience in like 5 hours of reading?
Yeah, exactly.
You're powering through someone's life, their peaks and their troughs and everything in between. And you're like seeing a pattern emerge. Because I notice when you read biographies, you start to see like the same kind of tenacity, the same kind of perspective, the same kind of relentless pursuit with a slight hindrance to optimism over pessimism. Like these things kind of emerge.
Yeah, there's a really good interview with Walter Isaacson, the biographer I mentioned, and Stephen Bartlett in Diary of a CEO. And Walter Isaacson's done...
Oh, I saw this one. He was with Steve Jobs and...
So he's done Steve Jobs. This particular interview was around Elon Musk, but what he does really well at one point in the interview is exactly what you just said. So he's done Da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin. He's done all these biographies. And he starts to draw a thread between some of the different people that he's written about. And it's really, really quite interesting. And he's talking about it in the context of, I think, Elon Musk and concepts of tenacity and whatever. But yeah, I do think that conversation is interesting. And what you just said, I think, is very interesting, which is that you do read about so many different people and then start to kind of draw out some common themes, I think. But one for me is that it's never linear. And I always think about that. It's always a squiggly line, and that's fine.
Yeah, because people have sometimes a preconceived notion that things should have gone a certain way and they don't, and then it's how do you handle that as a CEO?
Yeah, I think looking back on some of these really amazing people from history and what they've done, it all seems so logical. Like how could there not have been a Leonardo da Vinci and really not have done all those great things? But when you're like looking forward and you're in the trenches with them about how little they knew at the time about what was going to happen or all that they would be, it could have gone a million different ways, and I think there's something nice and comforting about that and helpful in, I guess, enjoying the journey. Yeah.
And one more question for you.
Yeah.
For those who are listening and, seek to do as you are doing yourself, what's a mantra that you carry that has proven itself time and time again, that if you could just download it and give it to them and it stays with them, what would that be?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a very good question. I think We've spoken a lot today, I think, about, being comfortable with something not going okay and living, I think, in a gray area of, won't this work? Is this the right decision or not? And so I guess if I was to distill that into a mantra, I think it's incredibly important that people understand that they're embarking on a journey that is incredibly tough, but it's probably in the long run a lot more about going through that journey and the ups and downs than I think the destination, if people call it that. And definitely, like, whatever happens with FoodByUs, in my case, whether we crash and burn or we exit for billions of dollars or whatever, I don't imagine that final endpoint, whatever it ends up being, is the thing I'm going to look back on. It's all these little things that we're talking about, which is the journey itself in terms of how I've managed the team and what I've learned and the stupid lockboxes and all that. Like, that's the thing, right? And so I think the mantra in terms of like remembering that and kind of enjoying that and living within that is I think, arguably more important than, don't get me wrong, I'd love to exit for billions of dollars, but I think that living in that sort of space is quite important, particularly on like the really tough days as a founder.
Well said. Almost poetic. And I really appreciate you being here. I've really learned a lot about, how to think about your particular challenge and what you're doing in your space. And I'm super excited to see how this continues to scale and grow. And I really believe you're onto something. And yeah, what the hospitality industry are doing sounds a little archaic. And I hope that you really, pioneer this and help people.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.